Hello everyone, this is Dr. Willow Ariella coming to talk to you about using the scientific method in psychology, chapter 5 of your text. So I wanted to highlight some things from this chapter. The authors discuss the concept empirical as part of being objective. The word empirical, I find interestingly, has been misused a lot. Some people, think it means something other than what it means, and I've heard it used in ways that I thought was really confusing. And fortunately, your authors defined it fairly well. So in research and science, we want to try to be as objective as we can. And you might ask, why? Why do we want to be objective? Because we don't want to influence the outcomes. Well, ideally, science does not want to influence the outcomes. Some people's personalities might want to influence the outcomes. So we, when we are conducting research, we strive to be as objective as possible so that our own stuff doesn't influence the findings of the research that we're doing. And they discuss confirmation of findings, and I'll talk about this a little bit later too in this video, but they mention replication. And so ideally what happens in research is that someone comes up with an idea, a research question, that hasn't been tested before, that they know of from doing the literature review, and they do a study, and then hopefully someone else goes, wow, I wonder if they did that as well as they could have and got, good data, or I wonder, if we could do it better doing it this way, or whatever. So people say, that was an interesting study. And a lot of times people disagree with the findings because of their own understanding of that theory or that population or whatever. So they may disagree with the findings, and they may say, I'm going to do this study myself to see if those findings are really accurate. And so, so ideally this goes on in research, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. They mention things like self-correction. That's a really important concept in research. Unlike hearsay or anecdotal evidence, which really actually isn't in evidence at all, but unlike those sorts of things where your friends or family or someone at work says, oh, I tried so-and-so and I lost 20 pounds or whatever that is, unless we have people who can look at that thing and say, this study has all these problems, that that aspect of it wasn't done very well, et cetera, unless we can all look at that and say, with our experience, this has problems or that has problems, or this was done really well, and so we agree in this community, this field, that information is good. So the self-correcting aspect of science is a really, really important one. If you haven't heard of this book, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name. It's a Carl Sagan book, Demon Haunted World. Funny title. I think the title is pretty misleading, but it's he does a really good job of discussing many, many aspects of research, and I highly recommend it. Carl Sagan, Demon Haunted World. Anyway, one of the things he talks about is self-correction. So it really is an important aspect of science and research. Control, very, very important. You want to try to eliminate anything except your independent and dependent variable to try to see if one is causing the other. And this is really difficult to do, and we'll talk about that some more, but psychologists try to do that when they can, when it seems appropriate. It always depends on the research question. They mention on page 88 the lighting that was done in a research changing the lighting, and how actually people's behaviors changed because they knew they were being observed. That's called the Hawthorne effect. And then they get into the psychological experiment and variables. So I want to say here, I want to say it again and again and again, cause is very difficult to prove. Cause is very difficult to prove. So they talk about what an experiment is. They talk about how experiments try to determine cause and effect. X causes Y. But that is still very difficult to prove, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So they mentioned the independent variable, dependent variable. It can take some people, it took me a while to figure out the difference between those two and how you tell them apart in a hypothesis or research question. For me, what helped me, but it may not help you, but what helped me figure it out is the dependent variable, the results of the dependent variable always depends on, the results depend on the independent variable. So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. The dependent variable are the things that you're interested in knowing if they changed, your results. The independent variable is what most of the time we want to see make that change in the dependent variable, or affect that change, or cause that change. Dependent variable depends on the independent variable. I encourage you to look at other videos and information about how to figure out the difference between independent and dependent variable, because, you know, different ways of thinking about it work better for other people. That just worked for me. But they mention the term dependent is used because if the experiment is conducted properly, changes in the dependent variable scores, or whatever, it doesn't have to be scores, but you know, the data, will result from or depend on the manipulation of the independent variable. So regarding the lighting experiment, the level of productivity will change depending on the lighting. So kind of play around with that and see if that works for you, but check out other ways that people have kind of identified how to tell what the independent and dependent variable is, because I know it can be confusing. Extraneous variables. It can be very, very tricky, challenging, and a brain strain sometimes to think of these. The extraneous variables, you know, psychologists, researchers, they try to figure out, well, you know, what can we control? So, you know, you do an experiment in a lab, you control a lot of outside influences. You know, so there are different things that researchers can control. However, sometimes we can't think of all of them, and sometimes it would just be too costly or time-consuming or whatever to try to control for all of them. And this is one way that randomness comes into play, and we'll talk about that more later too. But randomness is also very important. So we're trying to control so that we can say it was only the independent variable that caused changes in the dependent variable. But very difficult, and you'll see why as we keep going on in this. So they talk about establishing cause and effect relationships. And they mention something that I want to highlight. So unless we have directly manipulated an independent variable, so that would be, you know, the lighting, we cannot really learn anything about cause and effect in our research. Only when we manipulate an independent variable and control potential extraneous variables are we to infer a cause and effect relationship. What's so important about establishing cause and effect? The observations cannot tell you why that phenomenon occurred. Only when we can give a cause and effect explanation do we begin to answer the why question. And that word begin, I think, is really relevant to research. The nature of research is that until a lot of studies are done, and a lot, you know, I don't know what that is, but it always a lot depends on, there's no exact number, so a lot depends on how well previous studies were done and things like that. But for a lot of research, the beginning to figure out things takes a long time. It really can, because of a lot of factors, such as extraneous variables, people thinking of different ways to conduct an experiment and stuff like that, different populations. And so, yeah. And they ask in a box on page 90, review the experiment we've just described. What extraneous variables did the researchers control, and should they have controlled any other variables? Great questions. Again, the extraneous variables, they're also called other words like confounding variables, intervening variables. They're similar, although the words mean slightly different things, but you might hear those other terms too. And so then they discussed how the authors of the study where they looked at DNA evidence compared to eyewitness testimony, they used several controls. First, they randomly determined what transcript a participant read. That randomness is really important. Why is the random part really important? Something for you to think about. The idea of randomness in experiments and studies is really important. So they go through some of the other controls that they used. You can think about what other controls they might have considered. On page 91, there's a box, pretty good box, I think. But I want to make a note at the bottom where it says the experimenter seeks to establish a cause and effect. That I want to reinforce. However, it is still difficult to say with absolute certainty that X causes Y. With absolute certainty, it is difficult. When you see headlines, for example, that say, aspirin reduces heart attacks or whatever, or, this drug causes that, or this drug eliminates that, or whatever. Unfortunately, those headlines tend to be, inaccurate. It would be more accurate to say aspirin reduces some heart attacks. So we can rarely say with 100% certainty that X causes Y or X always affects Y. And part of that's because we can't control for all the variables, and there could be things that we haven't thought of, or that we just aren't far along enough in our understanding of humans or whatever to say with absolute certainty that X causes Y. Very difficult to prove that. So if you see someone saying that, I would question it. And so they mention on formulating that research hypotheses that have been supported by experimental research can make important contributions to our knowledge base. Very good point. I would also say that that hypotheses that are disproved or disconfirmed also contribute to our knowledge base. So even though researchers may, say, well, I hope my information shows this, if it doesn't, that does add to the field as well. And so they mentioned the prediction in the research hypothesis about the relationship that you hope will occur. Then it has the potential to make a contribution to theory. If it doesn't occur, and if it doesn't occur on more than one occasion, more than one study, that also has the potential to contribute to theory and to our knowledge base. So disconfirming can be very, very, very useful in research. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be very helpful. I talk about types of statements and research hypotheses. The one on the bottom of page 92 in the box, the general implication form, that's a pretty common way to state research hypotheses. If this, then that. Although they make a point that not all researchers say if this, then that, but they may state it slightly differently, but it's still the same kind of thing. And it's a helpful way to state a hypothesis. It makes your independent and dependent variables pretty clear if you can do that, especially for you, yourself, so that you can be clear about what you're studying. They talk about the principle of falsifiability. So when hypothesis is proved false or, disconfirmed or disproven. So the results say, well, you thought that this would happen, but it didn't. And so this point is important. Even though you don't want such results to occur, your research must be capable of producing results that do not support your experimental hypothesis. So that's something for you to think about. Why are they saying that? And it is an important point. I would want to take a lot longer lecture to discuss that, but it is important to have a falsifiable hypothesis. And it kind of goes back to what the authors of your text were talking about closer to the beginning about the different, they were talking about, I'm sorry, on page 92, the types of statements. If you make a contradictory statement or an analytical statement, you can't falsify those. So you'll learn more about this as you go along. And then they mention at the bottom, page 93, just because you obtain positive results the first time does not prove that your hypothesis is unquestionably true and that you will always obtain positive results. That is a very important point. I want to say that this is one reason why one study alone doesn't say much. It says a little. It gives us a little bit of information. It gives us something to start looking at. But one study alone, and especially depending on how well it was or wasn't done, doesn't say much. It can be interesting, we can use it for things, but one study, you should not base, a decision like a life or death decision on one study. I don't think. That's, my opinion. And one study means we need more. So when people start replicating and adding to the knowledge base, and they keep getting similar results, then we start saying, oh, okay, this is really interesting. So this can have some value in our field, and it starts to gain more meaning. So one study, interesting, we want to look at it, we want to, take it for what it is, but one study isn't the be-all and end-all. And that's one reason why when you're writing papers, one reason for citing and for citing more than one thing is because one study in and of itself isn't the be-all end-all. It's only one perspective, and there could be a lot of contradictory perspectives. So your information will be made stronger if you have, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 studies in the same area that support your information. Really important. Something to think about. So they say you can never absolutely prove a research hypothesis. You simply cannot yet disprove it. It's an important point in science. Don't get hung up on these. I just want to share, some of the things that highlight some of the things. Then they talk about the types of reasoning, inductive logic, deductive logic, and what we use those for. From using a bunch of small studies to create theory. That's generally how it works. Or using theory to formulate a specific situation. So when you do a literature review, you are generally gathering a whole bunch of information, and then you say, oh, okay, I have a research question out of all of this information, and then you use your deductive logic from those studies, all that information that you gathered, to look at one aspect of it. So that's what they're saying in the deductive logic component on page 94, where people reviewed the literature and then they made a deductive statement from reviewing that literature and coming up with that hypothesis. And that's generally how the process goes. The table on page 95, pretty useful. It shows, what the authors kind of talked about in chapter 1 and 2. Forget which one, but one of those chapters where, use evidence to build theory, and then use theory to build evidence, and it's a circular cycle. non-linear process. So they do go back and forth. They do help and support and build on each other. Theory is built, more studies, theory is modified, more studies, theory is built, etc. So that's a great table, figure 5.2. An examination of that theory in past research may suggest a specific research project, deductive reasoning, that needs to be conducted. And then the results of that study may prompt ideas for more research. And that's pretty much how it goes. There's an interplay and an intertwining. Theory building from studies, and then theory modification from more studies, etc. They discuss a new view of hypothesis. It's interesting information. They didn't really go into much detail about what you do with that. So, for future consideration, I would say the study that they talked about from Proctor and Capaldi. Directional research versus non-directional. The authors mentioned that most researchers take a conservative approach and state a non-directional research hypothesis. It's, generally true. It's a lot nicer. It's a lot more ego-boosting, I would say, to say that your study proved something, even if it wasn't statistically significant. And that's the point that they're making here, is that from statistics, it's easier to make a stronger probability testing, to use different kinds of statistics to come up with a probability, higher probability with a directional hypothesis than a non-directional. So you just take that into account when you're setting up your research project. Do I want to be able to prove with a high probability that my data shows X? Or do I just want to be able to prove that, the independent variable does affect these two different groups differently, and maybe go from there? So there may be a good reason to start out with, say, a non-directional hypothesis, and then, as a follow-up study or a replication study, or, follow-up study, include, test a directional hypothesis. So sometimes you can do it that way. Okay, so we'll be looking at more in depth about independent and dependent variables, so I think you'll probably get the gist of how you tell those two apart, and then how you figure out what a quantitative or a qualitative study is, and you'll start looking at those two different models or designs, or a mixed model, and start looking at the differences between quantitative and qualitative studies using one of those chosen from your student guide. So you're going to start getting into research and how you start dissecting it, thinking about these different concepts that you're reading about, and starting to learn how research studies are reported on and the important aspects of them. So that will definitely give you some hands-on, more analysis type of using these concepts. So I look forward to your discussions. Thank you for your time.